The day was radiant with sunlight, the kind of golden warmth that seemed to invite inspiration and curiosity. In the heart of a bustling city, a public forum had drawn an eager crowd. People of all ages gathered to hear Elon Musk, the celebrated entrepreneur and innovator, speak about the future of space exploration and artificial intelligence. The air hummed with excitement, a mix of awe and anticipation rippling through the rows of folding chairs that faced a modest yet commanding stage. Amid the throng sat Emma, a small girl with a pink backpack slung over the back of her chair. Beside her, her mother watched attentively, occasionally glancing down at Emma's tiny hands clutching a notebook filled with scrawled doodles and notes. Emma was young, no older than 8, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose braid. Her wide eyes sparkled with curiosity as she absorbed every word Elon said, her mind racing with thoughts too big for her small frame. Emma had always been inquisitive. From the moment she learned to talk, her questions came like an endless stream, challenging everyone around her. Today was no exception. She listened as Elon described humanity's ambitious plans for Mars and the advancements in AI that could revolutionize life on Earth. Yet her thoughts wandered beyond the technical details. Something else nagged at her, a question born of recent conversations and the quiet musings of her young mind. When the time for questions arrived, a hush fell over the room. Attendees eagerly raised their hands, hoping to have their queries answered by one of the greatest minds of their time. Emma hesitated. She gripped her notebook tighter, her heart racing. What if her question was silly? What if no one understood why it mattered to her? Her mother noticed the internal debate playing out on her daughter's face. Leaning down, she whispered, "Go ahead, sweetheart. Your questions are important." With newfound courage, Emma raised her hand. It was small among the sea of adults, but somehow it caught Elon's eye. He pointed to her with a warm smile. "Let's hear from you," he said, his voice inviting. The microphone was passed to Emma, who stood slowly, her small stature dwarfed by the people around her. Clearing her throat, she introduced herself, her voice wavering but determined. "Hi, Mr. Musk," she began. "My name is Emma." The audience softened at her bravery, offering encouraging smiles. Emma took a deep breath and continued, "I wanted to ask, what do you think about Satan?" A collective murmur spread through the room. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, intrigued. Elon's expression didn't falter. If anything, his smile grew, a mix of curiosity and admiration for the unexpected turn the question had taken. Emma sat back down, clutching her notebook as if it were a lifeline, her cheeks flushed. The stage was now Elon's, and all eyes were on him. The auditorium fell into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the air conditioning became audible. The question hung in the air, unexpected and weighty. Conversations about rockets and robots had abruptly shifted to a realm far removed from science and technology. "What do you think about Satan?" The innocent curiosity behind Emma's voice contrasted sharply with the profound implications of her question. Elon Musk remained calm, his gaze steady on Emma. He had fielded countless questions in his career about physics, economics, and the intricacies of neural networks, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't technical and it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, personal, and undeniably human. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he considered his response. He leaned forward slightly, his body language warm and open, as though to reassure the little girl that her question was just as important as any about Mars or artificial intelligence. The audience, meanwhile, exchanged uneasy glances. Some parents in the crowd clutched their children's shoulders as if bracing for an uncomfortable discussion. A few laughed nervously, unsure if the moment was serious or simply the product of a child's unfiltered mind. Emma's mother rested a hand on her daughter's knee, a quiet show of support. "Wow," Elon began, his voice calm yet thoughtful. "That's a very interesting question, Emma." He paused for a moment, letting the tension in the room settle. His expression softened, and he addressed her directly. "Before I answer, can I ask you something? Why do you want to know about Satan?" Emma hesitated, fidgeting with the edge of her notebook. The microphone was passed back to her, and she took a deep breath. "Well," she said, her voice small but clear, "at church, I heard people talking about how Satan makes bad things happen in the world. I was wondering if you think that's true. Is he real? And should we be scared of him?" Her question, though simple, carried the weight of 1,000 adult debates. It wasn't just about theology. It was about understanding the nature of good, evil, and fear. The audience seemed to hold its collective breath, watching Elon with rapt attention. Elon's smile widened, not out of amusement but out of admiration for her bravery. "That's a really big question," he said, his tone gentle but deliberate, "and it's one that people have been asking for thousands of years." He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his knees as he prepared to answer. In the silence that followed, the audience felt a shift. This wasn't just a response to a child. It was a moment where ideas about humanity's fears and hopes might be explored through the lens of a curious mind. Elon's answer, they knew, would be as thoughtful and profound as the question itself. Elon Musk leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on his knees, his eyes meeting Emma's with genuine curiosity. The stark lights of the auditorium seemed to soften as he addressed her, his voice warm and steady. "Emma, that's a really deep and thoughtful question. I'd like to know, what made you think about this?" Emma shifted in her seat, clutching her notebook tightly against her chest. The microphone was handed back to her, and she held it with both hands, her small fingers trembling slightly. Taking a deep breath, she glanced at her mother for reassurance before speaking. "At church," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "I heard people talking about Satan and how bad things happen because of him, like wars, accidents, and people hurting each other. It made me wonder, is that true? Is he real? And does he really make all those bad things happen?" Her voice faltered slightly, but she pressed on, her earnestness captivating the room. "I don't want to be scared of things I don't understand," she admitted, "but I also want to know if I should be." The audience, previously uncertain how to react, now seemed visibly moved. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of amusement but of shared introspection. Parents exchanged glances, as if marveling at the wisdom packed into Emma's small frame. Even those who had initially dismissed her question as childish were now leaning forward, eager to hear how Elon would respond. Elon nodded thoughtfully, his expression a mix of admiration and contemplation. "That's an incredible question, Emma," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "First of all, I want to say how brave you are for asking it. Not everyone is willing to talk about things they're scared of or don't understand. You're already doing something very important. You're asking questions." Emma's cheeks flushed slightly, but her wide eyes remained fixed on Elon, absorbing his every word. He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of her question settle over the room. Then he continued, his voice taking on a slightly reflective tone. "You know, questions like the one you just asked are some of the hardest to answer," Elon admitted. "People have been trying to understand why bad things happen for as long as we've been around. Some people explain it through religion, others through science or philosophy. And I think the most important thing is not just finding the answers, but being willing to keep asking and learning." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Emma nodded slowly, her grip on the microphone relaxing, as she realized her question wasn't silly. It was significant. Elon smiled at her again, preparing to delve deeper into the heart of her inquiry. Elon took a deep breath, his gaze shifting momentarily to the audience before returning to Emma. "To understand your question, let's start with something everyone can relate to: the idea of good and evil. These concepts have been around for thousands of years, and different people and cultures have their own ways of explaining them. He leaned back slightly, his hands gesturing as he spoke. In many stories and traditions, characters like Satan represent something more than just a figure. They symbolize the struggles we face, our fears, our desires, and the choices we make between doing what's right and what's easy. The audience remained captivated, their eyes fixed on him. "Think about this, Emma," Elon continued, his tone thoughtful yet accessible. "Imagine you're standing at a fork in the road. One path leads to doing something good, like helping someone who needs it. The other path leads to doing something harmful, maybe because it's easier or feels better in the moment. That fork in the road, that decision you have to make, that's where good and evil come in. It's not always about a person or a force. It's about the choices we face and what we decide to do." Emma tilted her head, her curiosity intensifying. Elon noticed and smiled. "Now science has a way of explaining things too," he said, seamlessly weaving in a broader perspective. "Our brains are wired to protect us from danger, and sometimes we react out of fear or instinct instead of thinking things through. That's why people often talk about inner demons, not actual demons, but the parts of us that make bad decisions when we're scared or angry." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The idea of Satan, for many people, helps them understand these struggles. It gives a name to the challenges and fears we face, just like ancient myths gave names to storms or the sun before we understood them scientifically. It doesn't mean those fears aren't real, they are. But it also means we have the power to face them and choose how we respond. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as though Elon's explanation had lifted a weight. Emma sat quietly, her small face lit with understanding as she began to connect the dots. Elon's words weren't dismissive or condescending. They were empowering, reminding her, and everyone in the room, that the challenges in life weren't insurmountable forces, but moments of choice and courage. "Does that make sense?" Elon asked, his voice warm and patient. Emma nodded slowly, her mind still processing the profound simplicity of his words. The audience, too, seemed to buzz with newfound reflection. Elon had transformed a complex, age-old question into something that resonated not just with a little girl, but with everyone in the room. Elon's expression shifted slightly, his analytical mind evident in the way his words began to take form. He leaned back, his voice calm, yet charged with the kind of curiosity that made even the most complex ideas feel approachable. "Emma," he said, "what you've asked about Satan or the idea of bad things happening isn't just something people think about in religion. It's actually a very interesting part of how humans understand the world." The audience leaned in, sensing a shift toward a scientific explanation. Elon continued, "You see, humans are storytellers by nature. For thousands of years we've used stories to make sense of the things we don't fully understand. Before we had science to explain why the sun rises or why storms happen, people created myths and legends to give those events meaning. It's how our brains work. We use symbols and narratives to process complex ideas." He paused, letting the room absorb the idea before tying it back to Emma's question. In many cultures, the idea of Satan is one of those symbols. It's a way of explaining the things we fear: greed, anger, selfishness, and even the unknown. Instead of just saying, "I made a bad choice," people might say, "I was tempted by Satan." It's not necessarily about a real person or being. It's about giving those struggles a shape so we can understand them. Emma tilted her head, her brow furrowed slightly as she considered his words. Sensing her curiosity, Elon leaned forward, gesturing gently to emphasize his point. "Think of it this way. Imagine you're afraid of something, like failing a test or losing a game. That fear can feel big and overwhelming, right? Sometimes giving it a name, like Satan or inner demons, can make it easier to talk about and even face." The audience murmured in quiet agreement, the simplicity of his explanation resonating with both the scientific-minded and the spiritually curious. Elon continued, as humans, we also face big challenges, like poverty, war, or even the fear of change. Those challenges can feel so big that we look for someone or something to blame. But the truth is, many of these challenges come from inside us. Greed, fear, ignorance, those are the real things we have to fight, and they don't need a name or a face to be real. Emma nodded slowly, her small hands gripping the edges of her notebook. Elon's words felt like a window opening, giving her a new way to think about the complexities she had overheard at church. But here's the exciting part, Elon said, a spark of energy lighting up his tone. Once we understand these challenges, we can start solving them. We don't need to be afraid of symbols or stories. Instead, we can focus on what's real and what we can change. The room buzzed with quiet admiration as Elon leaned back, signaling he was ready to transition from the scientific to the deeply personal. The stage was set for his most uplifting message yet. Elon smiled at Emma, his eyes softening as he prepared to offer her, and the audience, a more hopeful perspective. Emma, he began, it's true that the world has its share of difficulties. Bad things happen, and sometimes they can feel overwhelming. But do you know what I've learned from all my work in science and technology? Emma shook her head, her curiosity renewed. I've learned that people have an incredible ability to do good, he said, his voice steady yet uplifting. For every challenge we face, whether it's fear, greed, or ignorance, there's someone out there working to make things better. Humans are problem solvers. We've built amazing things, cured diseases, and even started exploring other planets. That's not because the world is perfect, it's because we refuse to give up when things are hard. The audience began to nod, the quiet power of his words rippling through the room. Elon continued, his tone growing more passionate. What's important isn't fearing bad things or trying to avoid them. It's focusing on what we can do to make things better. Instead of worrying about symbols or stories like Satan, we should ask ourselves, what can I do to help? Even small actions like being kind to someone or learning something new can make a big difference. Emma's eyes widened, the weight of his words settling in her young mind. But what if things still go wrong? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Elon smiled gently. Things will go wrong sometimes, he admitted. That's part of being human. But what matters is how we respond. We can choose to learn, to grow, and to keep trying. And every time we do that, we make the world a little better. The room was silent, captivated by the clarity and simplicity of his message. Elon glanced briefly at the audience, then returned his gaze to Emma. You know, Emma, I've met so many people who are working on incredible things, people who are making the world cleaner, smarter, and safer. And do you know what they all have in common? What? Emma asked, leaning forward. They believe in hope, Elon said. They believe that no matter how big the challenge, we can face it together. And I think that's the most important thing to remember. We're not alone. We can all help each other. Emma's lips trembled slightly as she processed his words, and her eyes glistened with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming reassurance his words brought. She nodded, holding her notebook close to her chest as if it now contained the secret to navigating life's uncertainties. The audience erupted in applause, a thunderous show of appreciation not just for Elon's answer, but for the profound sense of hope and unity he had inspired. Emma glanced at her mother, who smiled down at her with pride, and for the first time, Emma felt like she had a way to understand the world that didn't rely on fear. As Elon leaned back, a calm smile on his face, he knew his words had planted a seed not just in Emma, but in everyone who had listened. It wasn't about what was wrong with the world. It was about what could be made right. The room remained quiet, the audience still hanging on Elon's every word. Emma, emboldened by his reassuring tone and the warm applause from the crowd, hesitated for only a moment before raising the microphone again. Her voice was soft but carried the earnestness of her young heart. So, Does that mean we don't need to worry about Satan? She asked, her wide eyes fixed on Elon. The simplicity of her question struck the room like a chord, resonating with both the innocence of a child and the deeper concerns shared by the adults around her. Elon's expression softened further, his gaze steady and kind. He let the question linger for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved before responding. "Emma," he began, leaning forward slightly as if speaking directly to her and no one else. "It's okay to recognize things that scare us or seem difficult to understand. Fear is a natural part of being human. But the most important thing isn't whether something like Satan is real or not. It's about how we face our fears and challenges." Emma's brow furrowed slightly as she listened, her curiosity undeterred. Elon continued, his tone gentle but deliberate. "When we focus too much on fear, it can stop us from doing the things that really matter. Instead of worrying about what might happen, we should think about what we can do. What can we build? Who can we help? How can we make the world a better place?" He gestured slightly, as though encompassing the room and the broader world beyond it. "You see, the world has so many amazing opportunities. You could grow up to invent something that helps people, to care for those who need it, or to solve problems no one else has figured out yet. The more time you spend creating and helping, the less time you'll have to be afraid." Emma nodded slowly, her small hands gripping the microphone with newfound confidence. "So, I should try to do good things instead of being scared?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. "That's exactly it," Elon replied with a warm smile. "It's not about ignoring fears. It's about choosing to focus on what you can do to make things better. That's how we make the world a brighter place, one small action at a time." The audience erupted in soft murmurs of agreement and admiration, the simplicity of his advice striking a chord. Emma smiled shyly, her earlier nervousness replaced by a sense of purpose. As the microphone was passed back, the crowd seemed to exhale collectively, basking in the warmth of the moment. The room began to settle again, and Elon leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He looked at Emma with a thoughtful expression, the kind that signaled he was about to share something personal. "Emma," he said, "can I tell you a little story? It's about something I struggled with when I was younger." Emma nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with anticipation. The audience leaned in, sensing that this wasn't just going to be an anecdote. It was going to be a glimpse into the mind of someone who had faced and overcome his own fears. "When I was a boy," Elon began, his voice calm and reflective, "I loved to read. I'd spend hours every day in books about science, space, and technology. But school wasn't easy for me. I was smaller than most of the other kids, and I didn't fit in very well. I was teased a lot. Sometimes it felt like I didn't belong anywhere." The audience grew still, the vulnerability in Elon's words catching everyone off guard. He continued, "There were days when I felt really scared of going to school, scared of what people thought of me, and scared that I'd never be able to do the things I dreamed about. It felt like I had my own inner demons, whispering that I wasn't good enough." Emma's expression softened, her young heart resonating with the universal feeling of fear and doubt. Elon smiled gently, his voice growing steadier. "But then I realized something. Those fears weren't going to go away on their own. I had to face them. So, I decided to focus on what I loved instead of what I was afraid of. I kept reading, kept dreaming, and eventually I started building things. Little inventions, experiments, anything that kept my mind on the future instead of my fears." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting Emma's. "And do you know what happened? The more I focused on creating, the quieter those fears became. They didn't disappear overnight, but they got smaller and smaller until they didn't scare me anymore. And every time I built something new or solved a problem, I felt a little braver." The room was utterly silent, the audience captivated by the raw honesty of his story. Emma nodded, her notebook pressed tightly to her chest. "So you didn't let the fears win?" she asked, her voice tinged with admiration. "That's right," Elon replied with a small smile. "And you don't have to let your fears win either. When you focus on what you love and what you can do, those fears lose their power. They might still be there, but they won't control you." The audience broke into quiet applause, the sound swelling as Elon sat back, his story leaving an indelible mark on everyone in the room. Emma's face lit up with a mix of understanding and determination. For her, and for everyone listening, it wasn't just a story about Elon Musk. It was a story about the courage it takes to face life's challenges and the endless possibilities that come from choosing hope over fear. The room seemed to pause, as if the weight of Elon's words had settled into every corner. Emma sat still for a moment, her small hands gripping her notebook tightly. Her wide, curious eyes now shimmered with tears, not from fear or sadness, but from a wave of reassurance and inspiration that was almost too big for her to contain. The microphone was passed back to Emma. She hesitated, her lips trembling as she looked up at Elon. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice cracking slightly as she fought to hold back the tears. "Thank you for saying that, for telling me it's okay to be scared, but to keep trying." Her mother rested a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder, her own expression a mixture of pride and emotion. The audience, too, was visibly moved. Even those who had come expecting a purely intellectual discussion now found themselves drawn into a moment that was deeply human. Emma sniffled and wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her jacket. I feel less afraid now," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "I want to do good things too, like you said. I want to help people and make the world better." The purity of her statement struck the audience, and a quiet murmur spread across the room. Some dabbed at their own eyes with tissues, moved by the courage and innocence of this young girl who had asked the kind of question many adults might shy away from. Elon's face softened even further. He leaned forward, his posture open and encouraging. "Emma," he said gently, "you've already started. Asking questions like the one you asked today, that's how we make the world better. You've inspired everyone here, including me." The tears that Emma had been holding back began to fall freely, but this time they were accompanied by a bright, determined smile. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The audience broke into applause, the sound rising like a wave that filled the room. Emma's mother leaned down to hug her, whispering something in her ear that made Emma's smile widen. It was a moment of unspoken connection and hope, one that would linger in the hearts of everyone present. As the applause slowly subsided, Elon stood and walked over to Emma's side. He knelt slightly to meet her at eye level and gently patted her shoulder. "You're going to do amazing things, Emma," he said with a warm smile. "I can already tell." Emma nodded, her cheeks still wet with tears but glowing with newfound confidence. Her notebook, which had been clutched tightly throughout the forum, now seemed like a symbol of the ideas and dreams she would carry forward. She whispered, "I won't forget what you said." "I'm glad," Elon replied, standing back up and glancing at the audience. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of people who were visibly moved, parents holding their children closer, couples exchanging thoughtful looks, and individuals sitting quietly, clearly reflecting on their own lives. The energy in the room felt different now. What had started as a forum about technology had transformed into something deeper, a shared moment of humanity, vulnerability, and hope. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, not just for Elon or his words, but for the courage of a little girl who had asked a profound question and inspired everyone in the process. As the forum concluded, Emma and her mother walked toward the exit, hand in hand. Emma's notebook was now open, and she was scribbling ideas furiously, her imagination ignited by Elon's words. Her mother glanced down at her, smiling with a mix of pride and awe. "What are you writing, sweetheart?" she asked softly. "Things I want to do," Emma replied without looking up. "Ideas for how I can help." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. The hum of conversation filled the air as attendees left the venue, many still discussing the unexpected turn the forum had taken. Some shared stories of their own fears and challenges, while others spoke of ways they could bring more kindness and innovation into their lives. For Emma, the day had become a defining moment. As she and her mother walked down the steps of the venue, she clutched her notebook close to her chest, her heart filled with hope. The world didn't feel as scary anymore. It felt like a place where she could make a difference, one question, one idea, one action at a time. And for everyone who had witnessed the exchange, the message was clear. Even the simplest questions, when asked with sincerity, could inspire profound change. It wasn't just a lesson for Emma, it was a ripple of inspiration that would continue to spread far beyond the walls of that forum. This video was intense, but this video on the right-hand side is even more insane.